Excellent. Well, good morning, everyone. As Devin has mentioned, we do have a little bit of housekeeping. Your videos and audios will be muted, so this way it's easier for us to do the actual presentation. Any questions, please type them into the chat to everyone so I can see them later on. Kathryn will help answer at the end of the program. This program is being recorded and will be available at a later date. Now I'd like to introduce you all to Kathryn Schneider, a master gardener and professional ornithologist. Her birding career has included teaching college biology courses, managing a biodiversity inventory program, consulting for government agencies, and writing a book on birds of the Hudson Valley. I have it, very good. A committed conservationist, she is past president of New York State Ornithological Association, a former member of Columbia County Environmental Management Council, and a Columbia Land Conservancy volunteer. Good morning, Kathryn. Why don't we get started?
Great. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. I wanted to do this webinar because I've been feeding birds for a very long time. I've been feeding them most of my adult life. And I've spent a lot of money, some of it needlessly, because I didn't know what I was doing, and I've learned from my mistakes. So I thought I would share what I've learned about feeding birds over the past 50 years or so. I thought I would just want to show you this slide. You can read the comic, but I'm just going to try and give you a preview of what I want to cover today. I'm going to talk a little bit about how birds operate, their metabolism and their annual cycle, basically what it's like to be a bird in winter and how birds can survive winter in our seasonal environment. And then we'll move on to things like where you should put your feeder, why it's so important to keep your feeder clean, the different types of feeders and food that's available. And then we'll get on to dealing with uninvited guests, things like squirrels and possums and bigger animals. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about learning to identify birds and a program that's going on next weekend that's sponsored by Cornell and a lot of other conservation organizations. It's called the Great Backyard Bird Count. That's a lot of fun. And that's partly the impetus for doing this presentation as well. I also want to talk about the pictures that are in this presentation. I basically have 3 pictures from 3 sources in here. I have some from my book that were taken by good photographers. I have some of my own. You'll be able to recognize those because they're not very good. I'm not much of a photographer. And then I have some pictures that I have shamelessly stolen from the internet. And in that case, I've tried to credit whoever took those pictures as well. Okay, so birds are active, probably among the most visible animals that we can watch. They are extremely active in that they fly, and flying is one of the most energetically expensive forms of locomotion. If you actually look at how many calories are used to get around, flying costs a lot more in calories than walking or swimming or any other kind of locomotion. So in order to fuel that high energy activity of flying, birds have evolved to maintain a very high body temperature. Their body temperature is about 104 degrees Fahrenheit. And they basically need a lot of food to be able to maintain that high body temperature. How much they need depends on a couple of things. Depends on what they're doing. If they're flying around a lot, looking for food, defending territory, singing their hearts out, gathering nesting material, all the things that birds do, those kinds of active behaviors cost a lot in energy. It also depends very much on the surrounding temperature. The ambient temperature promotes heat loss. So even though they have this wonderful feather coat that is a great insulator, they are constantly losing heat to the environment. So the take-home message there is that birds need a whole lot more food in winter than they do during the summer. So birds like this bird here, when it gets to be cold in winter, there are a number of things they're faced with. There's, first of all, when it's cold, one of their major sources of food, insects, disappears. Insects are cold-blooded, and they make dormant forms basically during the winter. They can live in water, they can exist as eggs, they can exist as larvae or pupae, but there aren't very many flying insects. You're not going to find a lot of active caterpillars unless they're dormant. You're not going to find flying grasshoppers or butterflies or anything else that birds would feed their babies. And they feed their babies insects because that's protein. And even if they eat seeds themselves, most birds feed their babies animal material because they grow faster and the protein is good for them. So in a seasonal environment, they not only don't have that food available to them, that's one source that's completely gone. And the other thing is that the days get shorter. So you have much less time during the day to find food. And this impacts birds dramatically. So how do they survive? Well, birds have a couple of choices. This is a yellow warbler. It's an insectivorous bird, has a little needle point shaped bill. So for picking insects off vegetation, it's a foliage gleaner. And these guys, along with their other insectivorous friends, basically clear out. They migrate. They leave the area and spend the winter in warmer places like South America and Central America. So that is one life history strategy that birds can do. But there are some birds, of course, that are here in winter. They're just not as many of them. The neotropical migrants clear out, and then we're left with the birds that are adapted to be able to find food during winter as well as summer. So these are some of them. Chickadees, we know chickadees are here all winter. They're here in abundance. They feed their young caterpillars, of course, and they eat a lot of animal material in the summer them too. So they do their breeding and high energy things during the summer when the living is easy. And in winter, they are able to switch their diet. So instead of eating like 80% animal matter, which they do during the summer, they will instead shift their diet and take things like sunflowers from your feeders instead. So they are able to make their diet more vegetarian during the winter and survive that way. These guys here, these are horned larks and snow buntings, and they are seed-eating birds. We get a lot of seed-eating birds that are able to survive the winter here because there's lots of seed around. So sparrows, we get sparrows, they eat seeds, and their bills are adapted for taking the seeds off these various food sources. And turkeys are here all winter, and they eat acorns and beech nuts that they can find under the snow. So they're able to make it through the winter here as well. Other birds that can survive the winter here are fruit-eating birds. These are the bad pictures, these are mine. This is a northern mockingbird, and he spends the winter often on a multiflora rose plant, picking those multiflora rose berries off and eating them all winter long. This is a pine grosbeak, and the birds shift their fruit diet over the winter. They'll start with things like grapes and cherries that are available in the fall, move on to things like poison ivy, and as the winter goes on, they'll shift to things like crab apples, like this pine grosbeak is eating. Crab apples benefit from freezing and thawing, then they get soft enough so the birds can really eat them. So the fruit diet shifts over the winter. By now, most of our fruit eaters are shifted to sumac, crab apples, and other thing, bittersweet. There's a fair amount of bittersweet left. So they've eaten all the good stuff now, and they're moving on to what's left. And spring is going to come just in time for them to shift to an animal diet. Woodpeckers are resident here year-round, and they're of course eating dormant insects. So this pileated woodpecker is going to tear apart this dead tree trunk and find a boring insect inside. Waterfowl are able, and Canada geese aren't a particularly good example because they eat an awful lot of corn, but waterfowl in general can get most of their food from the water. Their bill's perfectly adapted for straining out aquatic insects and other stuff that's in the water year-round. This is a belted kingfisher. They eat fish, and as long as there's open water, we'll still have belted kingfishers every year. Same thing with waterfowl. As soon as the open water's gone, they got to move someplace else, but they'll stay as long as there's open water. And raptors. Raptors are birds like hawks and owls that eat other animals. So this is a peregrine falcon. He eats birds, little birds like sparrows and sometimes pigeons. Eagles are good scavengers on fish. We have them year round. And there are accipiters like Cooper's hawks and sharp-shinned hawks that eat birds, and they'll even take birds off your feeder. So these are the birds that are able to survive here in the winter. And they are adapted for eating particular kinds of seeds that are available year round. What we want to do when we're feeding birds this winter is to try and the birds will be able to attract are the ones that we can copy the kinds of foods that they're getting in nature naturally. So that's one of my important take-home messages is try and feed birds in the places and the kinds of foods that they would eat naturally. And you'll get a lot more birds at your feeders that way. Okay, I want to point out that we feed birds because we love seeing them. We can get them up close and personal by feeding them at a feeder. They do not need your help. Birds, we love the idea that we are helping birds out in winter by feeding them. And sure, anybody's going to take a free lunch if they can get it, but they don't need your help. And if you let your feeder go empty, the birds will not die. They will find food in other places. Unless you have tremendous numbers of birds at your feeder, they will not become dependent on your feeder. So we want to see birds better, and that's a good reason to feed them. We can learn from feeding birds as well. This webinar is not about bird identification, but if you start watching birds, I feel fairly confident that you'll want to know what some of them are. And I want to tell you, this is in the resources that I've distributed, that Cornell has a free app for your phone called Merlin Bird ID. And the way this app works is it basically asks you 5 questions about the birds. It asks you how big it is. It asks you time of year. It asks you main colors and where it's located. Anyhow, it asks you 5 simple questions, and then it gives you pictures of a bunch of birds, and you can pick your bird out that way. It is a wonderful identification tool for beginning birders. So if you only have a book, try to download the Merlin Bird ID app, because I find people really like it. You can also learn a lot about bird biology from a feeder. We learn about seasonality. We start to realize that we have different birds in summer that we do in winter. We learn about where the birds find their food. We learn about their behaviors. In spring, sometimes you can see cardinals doing things like courtship feeding. So there's lots of things you can learn from watching birds at a bird feeder. And I like to think that feeding birds is a stepping stone to real birding. I've made this case a number of times because real birding involves getting away from your feeder. It means you actually go out with your binoculars and look for birds in places. And I think a lot of people come to realize that they will see more and different birds, especially in the summer, if they get away from their feeders when the weather's nice. And then we can also contribute bird data to conservation. Many of us are recording our data in the Great Backyard Bird Count or in eBird, maybe weekly, and the Cornell Lab of Ornithology uses this information to make conservation decisions about birds. So one of the things I want to point out is that there's a cost to bird feeding. Inevitably, if you feed birds for a long time, you will have some birds die. And this is simply because we expose them to predators more by bringing them into feeders. There are cats around, and when you bring a lot of birds into an area, cats get some. They are exposed to disease more because, just like human beings, if there are more birds around, there's more opportunity to transmit disease. So some birds are going to die as a result of watching them at our feeders. There are things we can do to reduce these hazards, and I'm going to cover a lot of those, but I really feel that we should learn something if we're going to cost birds. And I think that education is something that can offset that guilt trip to some extent. Okay, so let's talk about where to put your feeder. First place you want to put it is obviously someplace where it's easy for you to see it. You want to see the birds up close and personal. One of the most important things, though, is to try and mitigate the problems with squirrels by putting them at least 10 feet from trees and other potential launching pads so squirrels can get at your feeders. Hanging a bird feeder from a tree branch is not always the best thing. Putting it on a pole sometimes works a lot better. If you're hanging it from a tree, the squirrels can get at it. So 10 feet from trees and other launching pads, and that includes things like your porches. Squirrels can launch from your porch. They won't launch from my windowsill a lot of the time. We've got the squirrels beat, but it's taken a long time to figure out how to do it. So start with this message. Try and get them at least 10 feet away from trees and other launching pads. Also, window strikes are a huge problem, and that they do kill a lot of birds. Birds haven't evolved with glass. They don't understand glass. So if you put your feeders close to a window or at least 30 feet away from a window, they can't get up. When they're close to the window, they can't get up the speed to be hurt by hitting a window from 3 feet. And 30 feet away, they're not likely to hit a window as easily. There are 2 problems for birds. There's this see-through effect. You can see this here. If you have a corner window, the birds try and fly right through it. They see the habitat on the other side, and they're going to be killed that way. That see-through effect is especially evident if you in these glass walkways between buildings in the cities. There's always dead birds under those because the birds just don't see them. They think they can fly to the other side. They also is a problem with reflected habitat. If they can see the reflection of glass, of trees in the glass, they will sometimes try and land on it, they get concussions. And we think that maybe they just hurt themselves and they fall on the ground and they fly away. Well, it doesn't always happen that way. Often a cat gets them or another predator gets them before they recover, or they go away with traumatic brain injury and die someplace else where we don't see them. Potted plants on windowsills are also a problem because it looks like habitat to a bird. So I hate to tell you to move your plants away from the windowsill if it's close to a bird feeder, because that all these things can cause birds to hit windows. Now there are decals and things that you can put on the windows that you can see through, and that's what's shown in this slide. These are striped decals that are on the outside of the window. They don't stick well in the cold weather, so you have to wait till it gets warm before you put them on, and you have to put them close enough together. About 4 inches is about how close you want them, so the birds don't think they can fly between them, okay? But there are ways to mitigate this problem of window crashes, which is a real issue for many birds. And then I would also advise you to place your feeders near some kind of low cover. This bad picture is a picture of a Cooper's hawk, and this is one of my bird feeders. Tried to take a bird off the feeder, and the little birds go down into this low cover where he can't get them. There are lots of juncos and white-throated sparrows under here, and he's up here frustrated trying to get them out. I see low cover as a way of kind of evening the playing field. The Cooper's hawk's got to eat in winter just like the other birds do, but this kind of gives the birds a place to get away from predators, and I think low cover is very important to them. Let's talk a little bit about feeder hygiene. Birds get diseases because we bring them into feeders. The disease caused by salmonellosis is spread through bird droppings. Salmonella is present in normal bird populations, but when you bring lots of birds together with lots of droppings, you increase the probability of them getting this disease. And there is a very large outbreak of salmonellosis among pine siskins out west this year, where the pine siskin numbers have been very high at feeders this year. There's been an eruption because of a good population growth up north, and they've come south to feeders, and they are dropping dead at feeders. They're telling people to take their feeders down and to clean them every day if they put them up because of this outbreak. Hopefully we won't have anything like that around here, but it does happen, and it's because of bird droppings. This bird has mycoplasmal conjunctivitis, which is a kind of pink eye, basically. It is also in the populations naturally, but it's spread when birds are close together. And it seems like house finches and goldfinches are particularly vulnerable to it. He can't see where he's going. He's basically blind, and he's going to die before the winter's over. Then there are a couple of other diseases. This kind of aspergillosis comes from moldy seed. Don't ever let your seed get moldy. It spreads, this is a fungus, and it makes birds very sick. And there's an avian pox that's a virus. Simply because we bring birds together at feeders, these diseases are more likely to spread. So what can you do about this? The Cornell Lab of Ornithology recommends cleaning your seed feeders with a 10% bleach solution every 2 weeks. And this is a pain in the neck, frankly, but it seems like it's necessary to protect the birds. I have a couple of suggestions. One thing is to think about the feeder design and how easy it will be to clean before you get a feeder. Tube feeders are a whole lot easier to feed than some of the houses, for example. And then a friend of mine uses a 2-feeder system. They have 2 of every kind of feeder. And every 2 weeks, they bring in all the feeders that they have. They put them in the dishwasher. They soak them in bleach solution. They put out the other set of feeders. So they always have feeders out there, but then they can switch them out and clean them periodically, which is a pretty good solution, I think. Most important, avoid old, wet food, food that's been, sometimes we get big rainstorms and the food in my feeders gets caked together with water. You really need to just dump that food out of the feeders, because it's really bad to have old, wet, moldy food, because it really does spread disease. Tube and flat platform feeders have some built-in design flaws that I'll talk about in a minute, but they basically, what happens is you put a whole lot of food on a platform feeder, the birds are going to be standing in shells and standing in bird poop. And so you want to not ever put too much on that kind of a feeder. And this white-crowned sparrow here is standing in the seeds of sunflower seed. And this is a bad situation. You don't want to let this seed accumulate under the feeders for a number of reasons. And don't you realize that every seed that you feed birds has an outside seed coat that is hard, and the birds will shell it. So they're only eating the starchy inside endosperm of sunflowers or Niger seed or millet, whatever seed it is, they're only eating the starchy inside parts. And the seeds are falling down under the ground. Their bills are specifically designed to fit that seed in and let them spin it around and drop the shell on the outside. So matching the seed to the size of the bill is one of the important things about what kind of birds you will get. But what you end up with is if you use black oil sunflower seed, which most of us do, you end up with this kind of accumulation under a feeder, and it gets moldy and it rots and it attracts rats and attracts other vermin. So periodically it's worth it to go out there and to scoop this stuff up and throw it out where it's not going to be right under the feeder. I'd also mention that sunflower shells have secondary plant chemicals in them, and they will very often stop stuff from growing under your feeders. Seeds don't germinate well on this kind of stuff. So it'll help your plants and it'll help the birds if you clean up under your feeders once in a while. I asked my husband to put his hand out here and hold a bunch of different bird seeds to give you some sort of a size perspective. These are a bunch of different seeds that I use from time to time, and they aren't all here. There are many, there's a bewildering choice of seed opportunities in the local bird stores. This is a mix, and you see a lot of these mixes. This is the economy mix, and it's very inexpensive, but the kinds of seeds that are in here don't all appeal to the same birds at the same time. One thing is a lot of this red millet in here. Red millet is a filler. Most birds don't like it and don't eat it. So you've got a lot of filler in there. They will come here and the chickadees will pick out the sunflowers. They love the sunflowers. You might get some mourning doves eating the corn, but they won't take it out of a tube feeder. So I generally stay away from most mixes. Now there are good mixes. There are mixes, there's finch mixes, for example. You can get finch mixes that include thistle and white millet, which are things that the birds really like. But pay attention to what's in these mixes and especially stay away from the ones that have so much red millet in it, because that's just filler. If I was only going to have one kind of feed at my feeders, I would use black oil sunflower seed. There have been studies that have shown that black oil sunflower, because it's got this rich, starchy inner part, is very, very attractive to many different kinds of birds. So I use a lot of that. This is striped sunflower. This is also available. Notice that it's a bigger seed. And I've been told, I don't know if it's true or not, but I've been told that birds with big bills, like evening grosbeaks, for example, actually prefer the big striped sunflower seed because it fits their bills better. The evening grosbeaks haven't stayed long enough for me to test this hypothesis this year, but it is used and some birds apparently like it better. I use a fair amount of this shell, these sunflower hearts. These are black oil sunflower seeds that have had the shells removed for them. The nice thing about this is the birds will often grab them and just take them away because they don't have to shell them, so they don't stay as long. But this does not create the mess under the feeder that all the shells do. So we have one of our feeders on our patio, and if we use this kind of seed, we'd have shells everywhere. By using the sunflower hearts, we avoid that mess. And the other thing is this is much more expensive. Sunflower hearts cost a lot more money, but there's less wastage, I think, and certainly there's less mess. I'll also mention that sunflower hearts, these are the whole seeds. Sometimes you can find sunflower heart pieces. It's kind of like the difference between buying whole cashews and cashew pieces, at the grocery store. The sunflower heart pieces are cheaper. They call them chips sometimes. I haven't been able to find them this year, but they have the same advantage in that they don't have a shell and they don't make a mess. I use a fair amount of this stuff. This is called white proso millet. You can usually find it in bird feeding stores and sometimes at Agway. This also has a little papery seed coat on the outside, but notice how small the seed is. This is perfect for sparrows, but the sparrows are not generally going to come up to your tube feeders or your platform feeders. They put this seed in their bill and they husk it and they just swallow it down, and it's perfect seed for them. I just throw it on the ground a lot of the time under the feeders, and we get tons of juncos and white-throated sparrows that way. Mourning doves also like white proso millet, and you can buy it as in single bags sometimes. It's not cheap, but you get a lot for your money. Cracked corn, some people I know have turkeys at their feeders. Cracked corn attracts turkeys. Actually, they're basically chickens, right? So, they mourning doves also like some cracked corn, so you can use that on the ground in general, not in the feeders above the ground. This is something called Niger seed. Some people call it thistle. It is not thistle, but this also is very attractive to finches. Goldfinches love this stuff. I will say that one of the things to know about Niger seed is it's a small seed and it dries out very easily. So I've had people call me and say the birds aren't using my Niger seed in summer. Well, that's because it dries out. Okay, it dries out very quickly, especially in the heat. So it's better as a winter food, I think. It tends to be attractive to redpolls, for example, and to house finches and goldfinches. Birds with small bills like this kind of seed. And I just also mentioned that I have storage can be an issue. If you store your bird seed in your basement, you're going to have mice, I guarantee it. So I store my seed in garbage cans, in big ones, little ones, all kinds of little, you can buy these metal garbage cans very inexpensively, and it tends to keep the vermin out, which is, I think, a great advantage. Okay, so next I wanted to talk about different kinds of feeders. And there's again, a bewildering array of feeders out there on the market, and you can make your own too. But they basically fall into several different categories. So I've tried to put these into categories. These are hoppers and houses. This is a house here. These are nice feeders, I think. They're difficult to clean, but the seed at least comes down gradually from the top to the bottom, and it is taken out and used gradually over a period of time. This has a house roof on it, which is helpful to keep the snow out. When we have snowstorms, the birds can still get at this seed. This is a hopper. This one, the birds have to sit on to make the seed come out. So it's fed gradually, and that's usually a good thing. In general, it's nice to have a roof of some sort. If the birds will use a house with a roof, it's nice to prevent the seed from getting buried in the snow. There are also tube feeders. I have several different types of tube feeders here. Tube feeders are easy to clean, and they dispense the seed gradually. There's holes the whole length of the thing, and the birds can take the seed out and use it. If you keep putting new seed on top, you're always going to have old seed on the bottom. And one of the things that I think is a design flaw in tube feeders is you always have this portion here that the birds can't get. And so you get caked, moldy seed in the bottom of these tube feeders. It seems to me it'd be pretty easy to put a cylinder or something down here to keep that from happening. But that is an issue. And if you have tube feeders, you want to be sure you get that caked, moldy seed out from the bottom of the tube. They are easy to clean, and that's a nice advantage. I can bring them inside and take them apart and put them in the dishwasher and then just rinse them with a bleach solution, which works pretty well. This is supposed to be a squirrel-proof tube feeder. Obviously, it's not quite squirrel-proof. This squirrel isn't getting a whole lot of seed, so he's not eating you out of house and home, but he is occupying the sites that you want the birds to sit on. And that's part of the problem. If you can't see the birds because the squirrels are there, what good is it really, This is a Niger seed feeder. So this is that tiny seed I showed you before, and you notice it's kind of a mesh here. So these birds are pulling the little seeds out of the mesh in this thistle feeder or a Niger feeder. And this is it's called a thistle sock, but it holds Niger seed also. And this is really easy to clean. You just dump it out and put it in the washing machine, and that will get it clean. You can use bleach in your washing machine then. So these are, a Niger seed requires a particular kind of feeder that has tiny holes in it so that it doesn't all fall out. Okay, another class of feeders are these platforms and trays. This is a feeder that my husband made probably 40 years ago, and we're still using it. You want the bottoms of these things to have a screen in them, so water and stuff will go through it. You also do not want to accumulate too much seed here. So one of the problems with these platform feeders is the birds like them. This one keeps the snow off, and in a snowstorm, we can watch birds here. But they're shelling the seeds and they're pooping in the tray, and that's exposing them to possible diseases. So what we try and do with this one is to not fill it too full, fill it periodically and dump it completely in between fillings. This is a kind of platform feeder that's actually for mealworms. It's made out of a mesh. Again, the water goes through it, and I use this for other things besides mealworms. I'm going to come back to the mealworm feeder in a little while when I talk about other kinds of foods. This is a platform feeder. It has no roof on it, and it gets a lot of birds because some birds do not like to have roofs over their heads. So the problem with this is it fills up with snow, and that lots of seed shells will accumulate in this. You need to dump it periodically and refill it. But I do use one of these because there are some birds that will not tolerate having a roof over their heads. They want to be able to fly away. This is a window feeder. I've used window feeders in certain situations. One of the problems is that these suction cups that hold it to the window sometimes don't hold very well in the cold weather. And with this one, the squirrels just sit in the tray and shovel the food in sometimes if it's on a low window. But I have put these on second story windows, and birds do use them. They're not easy to fill. I mean, you've got to, especially if it's a second story window, you got to reach out the window and put the seed in. Taking them down and putting them up is an issue. But there are certain situations when a window feeder works well. This is a peanut wreath. We got our peanut wreath last year. I saw this in Agway and I thought, wow, I like blue jays. What a great idea. So I'll try a peanut wreath. So we filled it up with peanuts, and we found that the blue jays would come and take them out. They can actually get the peanuts out of these in one piece. Things like titmice and nuthatches, for example, can't get them out. So what they do is they peck holes in them and they get to see inside seeds that way. But the problem with this is in the fall, I had blue jays coming in droves, and they would empty this entire feeder in a couple of hours. I actually saw a blue jay take one whole peanut out and put it in its crop, basically swallow it down its throat and carry a second one away. So it was carrying 2 peanuts away at a time. And I'm thinking, wow, what a waste of money this is. This is going to break me for sure. Be buying peanuts until I have no money left. So we took it down, and I just wrote it off to a bad experience. But then we put it up a few days ago, and the blue jays have not been cleaning it out the way they did before, but they're still coming to it. Blue jays cache food in fall. So I'm pretty sure what was going on in the fall is they were cleaning this out so fast that they were storing those seeds for winter. They were taking the peanuts and pounding them into the ground so that they could get them later, or pounding them into crevices. Blue jays are big cachers, and I think they were getting ready for winter. And I've not found the peanut feeder to get cleaned out quite as quickly in the middle of winter. So it's a working hypothesis at this point, but maybe I haven't wasted my money entirely. Okay, let's talk about some of the high energy foods that you can provide to birds. Birds would find these kinds of high energy foods in waxy fruits, for example, or maybe a deer carcass, for example, in nature. But high energy foods are particularly beneficial to birds in winter because they're burning calories at a very great rate. This stuff here on the left is something called bark butter, and you see the price tag here. It's pretty expensive. It costs like $15 for a tub like this, but it is marketed exclusively by Wild Birds Unlimited. The nearest one I know of is up in Saratoga Springs, but it is good stuff. I mean, the birds love it. It's spreadable. What we do is we put it in a log that we've drilled holes in, and only the woodpeckers use it because this takes advantage of the fact that woodpeckers like to be able to prop themselves with their tails when they're digging for insects and all. So bark butter is great stuff. It's fairly expensive, and it has to be presented the right way. If you put it any place where squirrels can get it, they will eat it because it's got peanut butter in it, and they love peanut butter. You can buy regular grocery store suet. This is just beef fat at the grocery store, and you can get that fairly inexpensively. We put that kind of stuff in cage feeders like this. The woodpeckers like that too. I want to point out that this is a particularly good suet feeder, not just a plain cage, because this woodpecker is able to prop himself here. It's like a tree. He's able to prop himself with his tail. So I've never seen a pileated woodpecker come to any of my other suet feeders, but this one that allows him to prop his tail and to get good leverage to get the suet out seems to be attractive to them. This stuff here is called all-weather suet. If you use beef fat or bark butter or other kinds of homemade high energy foods, you're going to find that they melt in the winter. This stuff is sold in the stores as all-weather suet, and it does not melt in winter. You can generally, if you watch the sales, you can get it for under $1 a cake. And they slide into these feeders very nicely, and it allows you to feed woodpeckers in the summer when you would not otherwise not be able to provide them with this kind of high energy food. They don't need it, but they love it. And they're in that time of year when they are feeding babies insects, the parents will often come to suet feeders, all-weather suet feeders. I'll just mention that they sell all kinds of all-weather suet. They sell it with nuts in it. They sell it with fruit in it. They sell it with cayenne pepper in it, so the squirrels won't eat it. You can get all kinds of different all-weather suet. Just watch the sales and buy it when it's cheap, because sometimes it gets a little outrageous. And then I'll just mention this stuff. There is a author and artist and blogger named Julie Zickenfuss, and she is a delightful writer. She's a pretty good scientist too, and she developed this stuff that she calls zik dough. And in the resources that I provided to you is a link to her blog where she gives you the recipe for making zik dough. It's a fun project with kids. Zik dough has lard and peanut butter and lard, peanut butter, chick starter, oatmeal, flour, and cornmeal in it. And you mix this up and you microwave the lard and peanut butter and make a soup out of it. And then you add the dry ingredients, and what you end up with is this kind of crumbly stuff. And I think what the birds love it, all birds love it. And I think one of the things I love about it is there are big chunks, there are little chunks. So the little chunks are attractive to the small birds. You know, the blue jays will carry whole mouthfuls away of it. It goes pretty fast. You cannot feed it in summer because it's got lard in it and it will melt. And it's probably too rich for that sort of thing. But she gets bluebirds coming to zik dough. And we've been putting out a handful every day on one of those platform feeders, and it's gone every day. They eat it so fast. And even ground feeding birds like the sparrows and juncos that normally would not come to elevated feeders come up to the feeders for the zik dough. So if you want to have some fun, make yourself some zik dough. I would just mention that there are probably some kinds of feeding situations that you haven't thought about. These are birds, these are bald eagles and ravens feeding on a deer carcass. I have a friend who lives in Austerlitz, and she has her property looks out on a big field, and she has a deer carcass out there, and she gets golden eagles coming to it. You do have to have a license to possess deer in New York State, but I'm told that if you hit a deer, the troopers will let you take it. So if you have that unfortunate thing happen to you, maybe you have a place where you could put a deer carcass and attract eagles. I will just also say that I live in an old house, and every fall we have a big influx of mice, and we trap them here. So rather than just dispose of the bodies in the trash, we put them out under the feeder, and we've had ravens come in to take the bodies away, and my son-in-law has had red-tailed hawk come in and take a body away. He's also gotten coyotes, but you might not have thought of carrion as a bird food, but it is, and it will attract birds. And why put those mouse bodies in the trash? Why not just recycle them as part of the environment? It can be very kind of entertaining if you do that sort of thing. I just wanted to talk a little bit about feeding birds in summer. One of the things is that birds feed their babies caterpillars for the most part. Caterpillars in forms of, of immature butterflies and moths are the staple of most birds for feeding their babies. The adults will eat other stuff, but those babies that are growing need caterpillars and insect material. So if you feed birds in summer, you're not going to get baby birds for sure until they've fledged at least. And what you will get is the harried adults that have been so busy feeding their babies that they've got to get something to eat. So they'll come and eat some suet for sometimes, but you will also get different birds. You can get things like rose-breasted grosbeaks in summer that migrate during the winter. If you put out hummingbird feeders, you can get hummingbirds as well. And hummingbirds are one of the delights of feeding birds in summer. You don't really need a hummingbird feeder. You can get them up close and personal if you have a hummingbird feeder, but you can just have things like impatiens or red tubular flowers. Any kind of tubular flower will attract hummingbirds. And I put fuchsias on my porches every year, and we sit out there on the porch and we have hummingbirds come within feet of us. So you don't really need a hummingbird feeder, but feeding hummingbirds is fun. It's also labor intensive because you need to make this nectar for them, which is usually 4 or 5 parts water to 1 part sugar. And this stuff goes moldy. And if it goes moldy, you have to replace it at least once a week. If it goes moldy, it will kill the birds. So having a hummingbird feeder comes with responsibilities. So I fill my feeders at least once a week. And if it ever gets cloudy, it has to come down even earlier than that. This is a hummingbird feeder with an ant guard on it. If you put up a hummingbird feeder, you'll see that ants and other insects will come and get clogged in the holes sometimes. What you do is you put water in this, and the ants come down and they drown in the water, which is kind of cool because the chickadees come and take the dead ants out of the water as well. So you have chickadees on top and hummingbirds down below. You do not need red nectar, okay? Red nectar that you buy in the grocery store or in the bird stores is just trying to get your money more than anything else. Probably the red dye isn't particularly good for the birds. Most hummingbirds have red on them anyhow. Hummingbirds definitely are attracted to red and red flowers, but you don't need the nectar to be red in order for them to come to it. That's just not necessary. And you can make your own nectar, as I said, 4 or 5 parts water to 1 part sugar is just fine. Another thing I like to do in summer is to put out fruit. This is a suet feeder, but it's got slices of oranges in it. This year we had Baltimore Orioles and Orchard Orioles coming to this to these slices of oranges, and they were so much fun to watch. One of the things you can also do is feed birds mealworms, especially in the summer. This is beneficial because these are a kind of caterpillar. This is the larvae of a darkling beetle, which is actually a pantry pest. I will say that they sell dehydrated mealworms in the stores, and I generally find that the birds don't like them much. These are, when you dehydrate them, you take all the energy out of them. You take all the soft parts. They have a hard outer coating on them, and that's what they're left with, the hard outer coating. So I don't think that dehydrated mealworms are particularly useful. Now you can buy live mealworms, and the birds love them. It's like a smorgasbord for them. They just love them. The place to get them is a pet store. Pet stores sell live mealworms. They culture live mealworms, and they sell them to people to feed their lizards and other kinds of pets. So you can buy live mealworms by the pound in pet stores, or you can culture your own. It is possible to culture these in a plastic container. I've done this. You put some kind of meal in there, and you get some mealworms to start it, and a potato, and you can have all the larvae you want. Don't do it in your house because, as I said, they're a pantry pest. It's probably best to do it in the garage where they won't get into your flour and stuff like that. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about unwanted guests. Some unwanted guests are easier to deal with than others. Squirrels, chipmunks, possums, raccoons, baffles generally work. You get it far enough away from a tree, use one of these stovepipe baffles. Squirrels don't figure these out unless they can jump from one feeder to another. They go up in here and they get stuck and they come back down. This is the same sort of idea. I think the stovepipe ones are a little bit better. But baffles generally do work. This is what's called a halo baffle, and it's supposed to keep squirrels from It keeps snow off, first of all. It's also supposed to keep squirrels from jumping down from above. They will hit it and they will slip off, but usually they grab the feeder on the way down. So I find it doesn't always work. But if you take into account location of where you put your feeder and you use some of these baffles, you can generally beat the squirrels and chipmunks and possums and the like. These are really small problems, and just a little bit of thought. You're smarter than the squirrel. You're smarter than the chipmunk. You can figure it out. Here's another. There are some people that actually feed squirrels. You can buy squirrel feeders. You can buy a squirrel feeder on what's like a slinky, and you can watch the squirrels bounce up and down. This is something on the left here. This is something called a Yankee flipper that was on the market for a while, and it still is, I think. The squirrel hits, there's a motor on here, and the squirrel hits the thing and it gets twirled around and thrown off the feeder. The problem is that these motors are rechargeable and they don't last very long in the cold weather. If you like to torture squirrels, you might like to have a Yankee flipper, but baffles are a whole lot more humane and work just as well. This is one of the best squirrel-proof feeders I have ever found. This is one called a Squirrel Buster. Again, they're not cheap, but they work based on weight. So birds are light, and when light birds sit around the edges, they do not pull this down and close the holes, okay? But squirrels, when they land on it, are too heavy. They pull this down and they close the holes. This is a good feeder. It doesn't have the problems of the accumulation of seed in the bottom. You can actually adjust the weight. It comes set for red squirrels, which are fairly light, but you can, if you have chipmunks, you can actually fiddle around with weight adjustment and maybe find a sweet point between the weight of a cardinal and the weight of a squirrel. So I think this is one of the best ones. And if I was going to recommend a squirrel-proof feeder, that would be it. Another problem we sometimes have is big flocks of blackbirds. Grackles will clean out your suet feeders in a matter of hours. And they will clean out all your feeder in a matter of hours. The thing about these big flocks of blackbirds is they're usually seasonal. They're associated with migration, so they come through in the spring and in the fall. My advice is if you get invaded by grackles and starlings that are eating you out of house and home, is just take your feeders down for a couple of weeks. They'll move on. They're not here to stay. They're just migrating through. And if you do that, you probably will, by the time the breeding season comes along, you'll maybe have a pair of grackles, which is manageable, and they won't eat quite as much. There are some bird feeding issues, however, that are more difficult to deal with, and that's these guys. Bears are a big problem. Bears are attracted to bird seed. And I used to think that the reason we were seeing more bears at our bird feeders was because the bears were expanding their range. That is not true. The reason we are seeing more bears around bird feeders is because we're starting to invade their habitat. I had fed birds here for 35 years and never had a bear at my feeder until this summer. This guy here came through, my neighbors took this picture, we weren't home. They came through in the middle of the day, and this is a fairly large male black bear. They tore down every feeder we had. They went through the garbage, which was not secure against bears, it was secure against raccoons. They ate my neighbor's fertilizer out of a bag. And they basically made the rounds in the neighborhood and did tremendous damage. I'm still replacing feeders. And we do not want to create a situation where we invite bears into our backyards. This happens most often in the spring when they're waking up for hibernation. They are very hungry. They shouldn't be out and about during the day. But in my area, we built a new rail trail here, which goes right by my house. And they built a trail through a ravine where I'm sure these guys live, and basically created a pathway to my backyard for these bears. If you have bears in your neighborhood, my best advice is to not feed birds in the summer. Or they just do it when the bears are sleeping. Feed the birds in the winter. That is the safest strategy, and that is the advice that DEC gives these days. Human bear interactions are serious problems. And when they persist, when people leave food around, they'll find their way into your garbage, they'll find your way into odds, they come back over and over again. So the advice is to not feed birds between April and Thanksgiving. The bears should be sleeping outside of those dates, and they shouldn't bother your feeders during that time. People try and be smarter than the bears. They try and do things. The birds are attracted to just bird seed. So if you just have the shells down underneath them, they'll come and eat that if they're hungry enough. They also, if the problems persist, the DEC sometimes has to relocate, or sometimes they'll actually shoot the bears. So if you like bears, you don't want to create this kind of a situation. So removing the feeders between April and December is the best thing to do. Another thing, I hate to do this, but I'm going to have to do a lot of this summer. What I've done instead is to try and plant a lot of native plants that the birds will feed on naturally. Put out lots of hummingbird feeders, which are out of the bear's reach. Some people think they can get away with taking them in at night, but these bears were active during the day, and so that wouldn't have helped. Also, they'd be attracted to the shells anyhow. At least in early spring they would be. So taking them in at night, if you want to do it, just don't forget. That's all I can say. And I got to tell you, I really wanted to continue to feed bears in the Adirondacks. And of course, I know that there are places in the world where there are bears and where people still feed birds. So I was bound and determined to try and create a bear-proof feeder. I did a great deal of research. And the way they do it is they put these feeders 10 feet from trees, 10 feet from any branches on pulleys. But some of the bears in the Adirondacks have figured out pulleys as well. It makes it a real pain to fill the feeders, but we created a bear-proof feeder, and this is what we got instead. So it might work to keep the bears away for a while, but long-term, I don't think this is gonna work. It's certainly not gonna work for the raccoon. And long-term, I think once the bears find this, we'll probably have to take this down. So my advice is, if you have bears in your area, do not feed birds between April and December. I just want to end by mentioning this great backyard bird count, which is coming up next weekend. Cornell, Audubon, and Birds of Canada are sponsoring this every year. They basically encourage people to watch birds at their feeders, to tally the species and numbers of birds at the feeders. And in the handout, I've given you a link so that you can learn more about the great backyard bird count. It's happening next weekend, and if you enjoy feeding birds, I hope you will participate. So I'd be happy to answer questions at this point.
Okay, so I'm going into the chat right now. One of the first ones is, what is the best way to keep starlings away from our feeder?
You probably can't keep them away, but if it's not a big flock, they like suet. I'd say first thing I'd do is take down the suet if you have suet. That's one of the things that I find they really go to. If you have a big flock coming through seasonally, take your feeders down for a couple of weeks and let them find someplace else to go. But I have typically one starling that comes and eats my suet a lot, but it's not a real problem because of that.
Okay, great. Let's see. Someone's in a new house. Hefter is in a new house and not a lot of trees nearby. How do I attract birds to my feeder? I have a suet feeder and 2 feeders with new seed, but no birds.
So I assume you have them on a pole someplace in an open area, right? I think they probably need some cover, and especially low cover is important. One of the things I like to do is I take my old Christmas tree and put it out under the feeder. The birds will be attracted to the cover. If it's a completely open area, it's really scary to them because they are vulnerable to sharp-shinned hawks and Cooper's hawks. But try even a brush pile. You can do a lot with just taking a brush pile and putting it under the feeder, and that will give the birds a place to hide. And I think that might help.
Okay. Is it true that feeding birds in the winter interrupts some birds' migration cycle?
I don't think so. Birds, when they migrate, put on huge amounts of fat, and their timing of migration is timed to day length. They don't do it by weather, they do it by day length. In general, I mean, there are vagrants that spend the whole winter here. There are birds that are being seen in Long Island now, like summer tanagers, that should definitely be down south. But I suspect what happens with these birds is that they run out of fuel. Migration is a is a very energetically expensive thing for them to do. And many birds die during migration, and just because they don't have enough fat on their bodies to make the migration. So the birds will stop at a feeder, find food there, and then not keep going sometimes. I don't think this happens for the majority of the birds. I think this happens to a bird that runs out of fuel and can't make it the rest of the way. So there are some hummingbirds that they tell you to leave your hummingbird feeder out late in the fall because you might attract a vagrant that will spend the winter that way. They can be attracted to stay, certainly, but I don't think you're interrupting their migration. You're just providing food when they would otherwise die, I think, most of the time.
So Michael Hughes had a yellow sapsucker at his feeder in early January. Is it rare?
No, yellow-bellied sapsuckers are here all winter. They're woodpeckers, so they're here year-round. They're just not as common as some of the other woodpeckers. Yellow-bellied sapsuckers tend to stay in areas that are a little more mild. So we find them most commonly down by the river where it doesn't get quite so cold. And it's not rare, but it's great to have one at a feeder because I don't find that they come to feeders very often. So that's wonderful.
Someone asked, what type of binocular do you suggest for looking at birds that is cheap and reliable?
Okay, good binoculars are not cheap. That's the first thing. But this is a whole another talk. But I will tell you that the soundbite version of this, you want binoculars that are at least 7 or 8 magnification, which is the first number that's on the binoculars. You want binoculars that that can focus with a center focus, for example. You want ones that are coated. You don't have to spend a lot of money on, you need to spend $200 or $300 to get a decent pair of binoculars. You can get them sometimes on eBay or sometimes at yard sales. I pick them up at yard sales, or sometimes Craigslist. You can get a decent pair of binoculars. Just don't go for something huge like a 10x magnification if you're a beginner. Those are better for when you have more experience. And get something that, there's the monarchs that are out there are good. Get a brand name, nothing that has plastic lenses in it. My book has information about how to choose binoculars. You just need binoculars that are appropriate for bird watching. You don't want binoculars that are wide angle ones and are designed for sports or opera glasses, because you'll never be able to see the birds that way.
Okay. How do you deter wasps from hummingbird feeders?
Wasps are harder. They sometimes that ant trap will work, catches some wasps because they tend to walk down rather than fly, but I can't keep them out of the feeder entirely. I would try starting with that kind of ant guard that I showed you, and then you'll just they're just going to be a fact of life with the hummingbird feeder.
Okay, I just wanted to remind everyone that in the chat, we also have the link to our recorded version of this program. We also have other available programs that we have done. So also, if you would like to donate for this program, since it was free, please, by all means, go to our website to do that. This is what helps us to do programming like that. Let me see. I've got a few others I'm working on going down. Yep, Devin has shared those in the link in our, okay. What is that feeder called that works well for the pileated woodpecker?
That is a homemade suet feeder. Okay, you can buy ones. It just has a long piece of wood on it so that the bird can rest its tail on it below the place where the suet is found. I believe that some of the companies like Duncraft, you might search online and look for suet feeders. Just try and find one that's mounted on a piece of wood so that the woodpecker can prop himself up with his tail while he's eating the suet.
Okay, I've also had Mary Jo Gibson has said she has had success not feeding squirrels for the last 3 winters, Sapphire and Niger. She treats the hearts on her porch feeders with red pepper oil. No
Yeah.
squirrels. Woohoo.
Yep, that cayenne pepper does work. It's kind of a pain to do it, but it does work.
Okay. Let's see. We also ask that anyone still in attendance, please fill out the questionnaire at the end, our Qualtrics link. We'd like to get your feedback on these so we can do additional programs just like this. Let's see, I'm going down. Okay, and also want to mention the Master Gardener Facebook page. That's also linked on ours. I'm going down to know. Thank you so much from Kathryn. Okay. Continuing down. Okay. Ooh. Wow. Where are they coming from? All over. All right, just a few more. Looking here. How do you store live mealworms?
Well, they have to have food. So if you start a mealworm culture, by the way, this is in my resources. The resources, there's a resource there for growing mealworms for bluebirds. You have to get a few live mealworms to start things off. And then I've grown them on bran. You can get oat bran. Usually it's fed to horses, I think. But you put that in a plastic bin, and you provide moisture by putting a wet sponge in there, and also a potato. And they reproduce. They lay eggs. You'll have adults in there too. But if you get the larval, but you want to harvest the larvae before they become moths and beetles. They become beetles as adults. So you'll have to let some of the adults survive in order to get more eggs and to keep the culture going. So they go through stages of eggs, the mealworm larvae, and then they become beetles. What you want to do is harvest the larvae before you get too many beetles. So this is why I advise, if you're going to do a mealworm culture, do it in the garage so the beetles aren't in your house.
Okay, great. This one here we have tons of bluebirds, but they never come to the feeders. We also have 6 bluebird houses, but bluebirds seem to favor only one. Any advice on placement, location, etc. for these houses?
Among the resources I've given you is the one that's by Cialis, Sialis. It's about mealworms, but that whole website has tremendous information about bluebirds and bluebird house placement and stuff like that. The adults, I have only succeeded in getting adult bluebirds to come to live mealworms and to zicto. That zicto does attract them. And I would think that if you put those kinds of food sources out in the summer when the bluebirds are nesting nearby, you might get them to come to your feeder. Winter, it's a harder sell, especially if you haven't had them coming before. In winter, they're eating fruit. One of the things I forgot to mention about feeding fruit, raisins are a good thing to feed birds in summer if they're fruit eaters. We have a catbird that hangs out in our patio. And if you put raisins out, they learn to recognize them as food, and they are fairly easy to tame to come to your hand. They just are bananas over raisins. So it's another thing that's fun to try.
Okay, we have a question. Just going to take a few more. Will pileated woodpeckers come close to a house? I have them in the woods, but they never seem to get them to the feeders near the house.
Well, I'm going to say I don't understand pileated woodpeckers. We have them too. They're in our yard. And in summer, we have had the female come. That's how I got that picture of it coming to the suet. I've never seen a male. I've never seen babies. I think it was a mother pileated woodpecker, was just so incredibly harried. She had to get something to eat herself. She was so busy feeding those babies. But the pileated woodpecker is in our yard in winter, and it does not come to the feeder. So I do not understand why. Apparently suet isn't their favorite food. Maybe if I could provide it with sawfly larvae or something like that, we'd be able to get them. But they don't use our feeders regularly. Other people are much more fortunate. Other people do have pileated woodpeckers in winter, but I don't, and I don't understand why not at this point. It's one of the great things about feeding birds. You learn a little more every year.
Okay, I don't want to hold everyone up, so we'll take this one last question. Kevin lives near a creek that runs all winter. Does he need to use a heated bird bath as well?
No, I mean, the birds don't need these things. It's just another way of attracting them to, they certainly appreciate having open water, and it's a matter of how far they'll have to fly for it. So what we do is we take hot water, we take a pitcher of hot water out there and put it in the bird bath early in the morning, and it lasts about half the day that way. And that way I don't have to run electricity out there. But water is, birds need both food and water, and that's another way to attract them close in so you can see them, but they don't need it from you. They'd be able to fly to the stream and get water that way.
Very good. Great. Thank you so much, Kathryn. It was fantastic. We've had lots of comments and kudos. Thank you very much for all the information, very concise, great informational presentation. So everyone seems to have loved it. Awesome talk. And we look forward to doing additional programs. Please, again, remember to answer the Qualtrics questionnaire, just so we know what to do in the future. Welcome, everyone. Now I see people. Wow, other than just us.
During my
so, yes. Hi, Dee Dee. I recognize a few of you individuals. Great to see you all. Again, answer the questions. Go to our recorded site. Well, look who it is, Joanne Schleich, also down south. Okay, so we've had wide variety of individuals. I'm so glad that you were all able to attend. I guess that's about it.
Thank you for coming, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All righty. Have a great one, all.